Have you been told the truth about what's happening in Ukraine? Let's talk about it. Volodymyr Zelensky has been exposed on the world stage in what will go down as one of the most historic press conferences ever. Sitting in the Oval Office, all the Ukrainian president needed to do was smile for the cameras and sign the deal. This deal, offered by President Trump, would have provided security for his war-torn country and helped to kickstart their economic recovery. But instead, he chose to act in a disrespectful manner, roll his eyes, cross his arms, openly criticize the US, and interrupt the president multiple times. He acted like a petulant child.
JD, you are speaking about. What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
It has also been alleged that he called Vice President J.D. Vance a bitch under his breath.
President Zelensky was caught swearing at U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. In this post, seen over 8.4 million times on X, greatly amplified all throughout social media, this user claims that Mr. Zelensky is said to have uttered the word "suka blyat" in a Russian slang phrase that is said to translate in English to the word bitch, amongst others, that I cannot repeat on air. This in response to J.D. Vance criticizing him during this meeting. So,
despite what you may have seen in the legacy media, this display was exactly what you should not do if you're going to a foreign country to demand money to continue bloodshed and death in an unwinnable war. Faced with a war that he could not win, he demanded that the US provide billions more so that he could continue on losing. But Trump is not Biden, and Trump is certainly not an idiot. He has no desire to continue throwing billions of taxpayer dollars into a losing venture, nor does he want to drag humanity into World War III. President Trump offered a deal, the only deal on the table for peace. Trump, you know what he's doing? He's risking a lot in opposing the military-industrial complex desire for forever war.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Zelensky, what did he do? He looked a gift horse in the mouth, not because he is stupid, but because he was put into power to provoke and to stubbornly continue a war of attrition against Russia. Stay with me here. When you understand the history of the Ukrainian conflict with Russia, you realize it's not as simple as our political class would like to make it appear. While Ukraine good, Russia bad is easy to digest, it doesn't quite stack up against the facts. People need to understand that Ukraine and Russia have a long history of being bound together. In fact, modern Ukraine is a relatively new invention. The region was, for the longest time, considered part of Greater Russia. The very name Ukraine means borderland, by which is meant the borderlands of Russia. Now, Western politicians and journalists ignore the fact that for most of its history, Ukraine was a key part of the Russian world. And here's where it gets interesting. The division between Ukraine and Russia was provoked not by Russian aggression, but by Western interference. The US and NATO had promised Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet Union president, that they wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward.
A profoundly broken promise to Russia made by the first Bush that in return for united Germany and NATO, NATO would not expand eastward. This is beyond any dispute. People say, well, they never signed a treaty. But a deal is a deal. The United States gives its word unless we're shysters. And if you don't get it in writing, we'll cheat you. We broke our word. And when both Putin and Medvedev say publicly to Madeleine Albright and others, we, Russia, feel deceived and betrayed, that's what they're talking about. So NATO represents, on the part of Russia, a lack of trust. You break your words to us. To what extent can we trust you? Secondly, it represents military encirclement. If you sit in the Kremlin and you look out at where NATO is and where they want to go, it's everywhere. It's everywhere on Russia's borders. But there's something even more profound that's a taboo in the United States. NATO expansion represents, for the Russians, American hypocrisy and a dual standard. And they see it this way, and I can't think of any way to deny their argument. The expansion of NATO is the expansion of the American sphere of influence. Plain and simple. Where NATO goes, our military force goes. Where NATO goes, our arms munitions go because they have to buy American weapons. Where NATO goes, Western soldiers go who date their women. They bring along their habits and all the other things. It's clearly, undebatably, indisputably, an expansion of America's sphere of influence. So there has been a tremendous expansion of America's sphere of influence since the mid-1990s, right plunk on Russia's borders. All the while, every administration, American administration, saying to Russia, including the Obama administration, you cannot have a sphere of influence because that's old thinking. Well, I mean, the Russians may be cruel, but they're not stupid. In other words, what they say is we can now have the biggest sphere of influence the world's ever seen, and you don't get any, not even on your own border. In fact, we're taking what used to be your traditional sphere of influence, along with the energy and all the rest. It's ours now. Again, this idea of a winner-take-all policy. This is the enormous resentment in Russia. The relationship will never become a stable cooperative relationship until we deal with this problem. Does it mean Russia's entitled to a sphere of influence? I don't want to speak for Jack Matlock, but Jack thinks yes, depending on what you mean by sphere of influence. They can't occupy countries. We had a Monroe Doctrine. I don't know what that meant. But the point is that until this is worked out, the relationship will never truly be post-Cold War. The problem is it's taboo in America to talk about this issue of who has a sphere of influence, who's entitled to it. I think there are solutions, but you can't even get the question asked.
This was a lie, a blatant lie. NATO proceeded to swallow up Poland, the Baltic states, and much of Eastern Europe over the coming decades, bringing its military presence right up to Russia's borders. Now, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine became independent, but the deep state in Washington decided to use Ukraine as a tool with which to weaken Russia. If Ukraine could be pulled into NATO, the West would have a military presence right on Russia's borders. Now, to no one's surprise, Putin made it clear that this was unacceptable. Now, it stands to reason, right? Would we want Chinese bases in Papua New Guinea or in New Zealand, for instance? No, we wouldn't. It's asinine to think we would. But the West ignored Putin's concerns and pushed ahead regardless. Washington poured billions of dollars into Ukraine with a view to bringing it into Western influence. But it went beyond that. In 2014, Washington helped orchestrate a coup against the democratically elected Russia-aligned president Viktor Yanukovych.
In 2014, the U.S. worked actively to overthrow Yanukovych. Everybody knows the phone call by my Columbia University colleague, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador Peter Piot. Listen to it. It's fascinating.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yates is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience, and, EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make.
You don't get better evidence.
From that moment until now, the West has handpicked Ukraine's rulers. And what have those Western-backed leaders done? Well, for starters, they banned the Russian language in official settings. And that's when Donbass and Crimea said enough. It's little wonder that almost 100% of those in Crimea rejected the Western-backed regime in Kiev and voted to rejoin Russia. Kiev didn't take kindly to rejection and instituted a brutal war that lasted 8 long years. Thousands of people died, but there was not even a peep in the Western media. These deaths were helpful to the West since they upheld the puppet government installed in Kiev. Meanwhile, NATO was arming Ukraine to the teeth, and Kiev had amassed forces near the Donbass. Putin was not going to stand by while the ethnic Russian people in Donbass were slaughtered for rejecting a pro-Western government in Kiev, and so he moved to put a stop to it. The West screamed that it was an unprovoked invasion. It was not. It was deliberately provoked. And now it is overseen by an actor, how fitting, who was installed as president by Western political powers to further Western political agendas. Now that very same actor, Volodymyr Zelensky, is doing the rounds of Europe, hoping that other nations will fund his ambitions to continue the bloodshed. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has sensed that this is his time for relevance.
And just try and whack it. Yes, this is good. And again. That's it. And again. Try and breathe. Relax. That's it.
With equally inconsequential French President Emmanuel Macron, Starmer is promising troops he doesn't have and money he has not yet printed. As of today, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has said that he is open to sending in the Australian military. He has already sent $1.5 billion to Ukraine. And for what? Europe cannot stand up to the might of Russia without the backing of the United States. For decades, the Europeans have assumed the US would come to their aid, and so rather than provide for their own defense, they've been busy with their globalist delusions, and now reality has struck them in the face. Now, if anything good comes out of this entire fiasco, it'll be that European countries realize they must provide for their own defense rather than assume on the good graces of the United States, a country they expect to solve every problem in the world. As for Zelensky, he has shown himself to be a fraud. Offered the chance for peace, he chose instead to insult President Trump and Vice President Vance, and then later declined to offer an apology. It's almost like Zelensky wants war. He was, after all, installed by Western nations in a bid to provoke a war so that Russia could be weakened. The decision to pursue NATO membership, despite the fact Putin warned such a move would provoke war. The decision to stockpile weapons on the Russian border. The decision to ban Russian language in the Russian-speaking east of Ukraine. All actions designed to provoke the bear. At the end of the day, Zelensky is a globalist puppet who is willing to let his country burn so it can rule over the ashes. The plan: destabilize Ukraine, drain Russian resources, push NATO to Russia's borders, power, control, and the sell-off of Ukraine's assets for cents on the dollar.
There is a company who wants to turn a profit in Ukraine, the US financial company BlackRock. And in fact, Kiev signed an agreement with BlackRock, launching a Ukrainian development fund. Under the guise of attracting private investment to the Ukrainian economy, what we're seeing is a transfer of state sovereignty to external corporate control by the world's largest investment fund. And it's worth noting that over the last decade, the number of the amount of arable land that was transferred to American agribusiness companies exceeded 4 million hectares. We hope that Ukrainians have at last understood that over the last 2 years they've been but a pawn in the confrontation between the West and Russia.
These globalists don't care how many lives are lost. These people are pure evil. Zelensky, a B-grade actor-comedian who played the role of a president in a Ukrainian TV show and then came from nowhere to suddenly magically become the actual president, has been well rewarded for his role. And so, there are many people, not least Zelensky himself, who seem to want a never-ending war. A war that makes certain people rich while everyday families lose their sons in a meat grinder. A war that sacrifices a generation of young men for no better reason than to make evil men richer and to push globalist aspirations of power and control. Donald Trump, President Trump, had brains enough to say enough. Enough of deep state bureaucrats working from the shadows, engineering wars nobody can afford and that nobody wants. Enough of mothers and fathers losing their sons in wars that were orchestrated not to defend freedom, but to achieve geopolitical goals dreamed up in ivory towers. But Zelensky has not had enough, and the leaders of Europe have not had enough either. They insist on going on. They will drive Ukraine all the way to ruin while having the entire world teeter on the edge of World War III.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's backed you far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
That much became evident in the extraordinary press conference at the weekend. Now the world knows Trump does not stand for Russia or for Ukraine, but for peace. And sadly, right now, he seems like the only one. I'm Senator Ralph Babette for the United Australia Party.